Let's open our Bibles this morning to Mark chapter 15, verse 6. As we continue through Mark's accounts of Jesus' life and his death and his resurrection. There's a reason that the Gospels spend 35% of their real estate on this last week and much of it on these last 24 hours as Jesus goes to the cross. It is because you learn God's love there. In fact, if you wanted to summarize the Bible really shines its light in two places. The cross, the empty tomb, and then the coming again of the Lord. It really is the message of the Bible. The Lord came and he's coming again. He came and he saved and he's coming again to deliver. So much of it is spent around that event. That's why he came. And you will find as you spend time there, and we spend a lot of time on Sunday mornings headed for Calvary. You will find not only God's great love put on display if you personalize what you read, and I know it's hard when you've read a story 100 times. It is easy to grow kind of dull to it, but yet to think that the Lord did this for you, not just for us. That would be good enough, but he did it for you. It should make us different, I think, in our response to his love. And as you look at the picture that the Gospels draw, especially around the cross, you find that there's a lot of reasons why people don't want to follow the Lord. And the excuses that they find, you can find them in the people that are involved. We have spent time with Jesus on his trials during the night before the religious folks who had come to decide that they were going to try to get him killed. They came up with some silly, some foolish, I think, accusations, but nevertheless, they drug him to Pilate early in the morning. Well before dawn. In fact, Jesus is handed over by Pilate to be crucified at 6 in the morning, according to the scriptures, where he ends up on the cross at 9. So these religious trials were all designed to come up with accusations, but then they brought him to Pilate, and we started there last week looking at Pilate. We told you that Pilate was a political leader that was on thin ice with the Jews because of how he came to power, because of what he did while he was in power. Suffice it to say that the religious leaders were sure that if they could come up with some semblance of accusation, that they could turn Pilate wherever they wanted, and they turned out to be right. Pilate was a weak man who knew to do the right thing and didn't do it. When they brought Jesus to Pilate early in the morning and dragged Pilate out of bed and wouldn't go into his judgment hall because it would defile them being in a judgment hall of a Gentile, Pilate said, "What has he done?" And they said to him with great disrespect, "Hey, look, if he wasn't some evildoer, we wouldn't have brought him to you. Quit asking questions," basically. Pilate went in and he talked to Jesus and in moments determined he wasn't guilty and came back and said he's not guilty. Whatever you're accusing him of, he certainly has no reason why we should put him to death. And then they began to yell at him, according to Luke 23, well, he's subverting the nation, he's forbidding us to pay taxes, he's claiming to be a king and a Messiah, the Christ and all. And Pilate went back and asked Jesus about being a king, and Jesus said, I am a king, but not of this world, not of this kingdom. He came to be a king in the hearts of men. If you get saved, Jesus moves in. You step down, he gets to rule. And again, Pilate didn't take this as a threat. In fact, he went back again and he said to these guys, he's not guilty at all. And they began to scream, Luke tells us, anything that they could come up with. Oh, he's been subverting the nation for a long time. He started preaching this message way up in Galilee and he's brought it now to Jerusalem. And Pilate no sooner heard Galilee, he went, oh, good, I'm out off the hook. I don't want to deal with these guys. Pilate is not in charge of the Galilee. Herod is. And Herod was in town, so he marched Jesus off early morning off to Herod, who was in town, had the jurisdiction. And we talked about Pilate last week, that he was a man who was very close to the gospel. John the Baptist had shared with him. He had heard him gladly, had protected him for a while from his angry wife, who had gotten angry when John the Baptist spoke out about his illicit marriage relationship. Ended up killing him in the long run, but for a while he was very sensitive to hear. He heard him gladly. Those are pretty strong words. A couple years later now, we find Herod just hardened to Jesus. He makes fun of him. He belittles him when he won't do the tricks that he wants to see from him. he has his soldiers beat him and send him back to Pilate, a man that was so close for a while, but now was so hard he wanted nothing to do with Jesus at all. So we arrived this morning with Pilate, who thought he dodged a bullet getting Jesus back. And we will once again look at Pilate this morning under the weight of the demands of the people standing at his door, unable to do the right thing, a weak kind of self-serving man who will ultimately send Jesus to the cross. In fact, verse 15 of our chapter this morning says that he did it to gratify the crowds. Can you imagine? He did it to gratify the crowds. He will say in Luke that he gave in to their request, that the chief priests and all prevailed. I'll fill in for you. You don't need to flip around with me this morning. Maybe you can mark in the margins what takes place where. But between verse 5 and verse 6, where Jesus is returned to Herod. Herod isn't covered by Luke, but Luke tells us a couple of things that take place between verse 5 and 6 that I'll read to you. You can mark them down there. But here's what Luke writes in chapter 23. Then Pilate, when he had called together all of the chief priests and the rulers and the people, said to them, "You have brought this man to me as one who misleads the people. Indeed, I've examined him in your presence. I found no fault in him, in this man, concerning those things of which you accuse him. And no, neither has Herod, because I sent you back to him. And indeed, nothing deserving of death has been found in him. But I will chastise him and release him, because it was necessary on that day to release one at the feast." So Pilate gets Jesus back, and he has another meeting with these accusers at the gate. And he says to them what he will say 9 different times over these few hours. Not guilty. 9 times. He's convinced of his innocence. He knows, according to the scriptures, that the Jews have brought Jesus to him only out of envy, because Jesus had drawn the crowds and they had been shown for what they were. They were phonies, and they didn't like it. And so he wanted to release them, but he was afraid of this Jewish political influence in Rome. And so he comes out and he says, he's innocent, like I told you before. And if that isn't enough, I sent you to Herod, and Herod says the same thing about him. You guys are way off base here. He's not guilty. But, he says, in order to escape the complete responsibility, I will scourge him and then let him go. Now understand that Pilate is hearing all kinds of voices. Pilate hears the voice of the religious leader on the doorstep making all kinds of threats, calling for a gross miscarriage of justice. His conscience is speaking to him. He's wrestling with it because he knows Jesus is innocent. He knows the reason he's standing before him. He knows what these guys at the door have been up to. He wants to do the right thing, but there's a tremendous cost attached to doing it. Kind of like us. We get to know the Lord. We know his ways are right, but there's still a choice to be made. It's a hard choice sometimes. And in our culture today, it becomes more difficult to stand up for him in a world that wants nothing to do with him. A couple of different times, Pilate will make mention of Jesus' demeanor, how quiet he was, how he wasn't upset, he wasn't screaming and yelling. His words bore true. He feared him. Herod agreed with him. In a few minutes, his wife will send a note. Hey, I've been dreaming tonight, and this just man should be let go. Don't have anything to do with him. He's hearing it all coming at him all at once. And you can watch Pilate kind of break down. All the law and order grinds to a halt as the judge goes out to the crowd to argue for justice, trying to justify himself. And then you read it in Luke 23, verse 15, the most horrible thing. He said, I'll just chastise him or beat him, if you will, and that when I beat him, I'll release him. The first question you want to ask is, are you going to beat an innocent man? What kind of compromise is that? The Lord's already bloodied before you. He's been up all night. He's been beaten up by several different groups. Now you want to try to somehow, meet them halfway by going and doing this despicable thing? Pilate's a pretty good example to us that you can't do, the wrong thing in the short term in the hopes of doing the right thing in the bigger scheme of things. Here's his logic. He'll get hurt, but he'll live. Right? I'll get him out of here. I'll satisfy the bloodthirsty men at the gate. I know he's innocent. I can get him out of here alive. And so I'll beat him within an inch of his life, but then I'll let him go. And I'll be out from under the pressure, and they won't report me to Rome, and everyone will go home happy. Really? Is that the way that works? Does the end really justify the means? It doesn't. And his hope that the crowd's thirst for blood would be satisfied won't work either. Won't work either. Now, if you were a Roman in those days or beaten by Romans, Roman scourging was rough. History tells us 75% of the people beaten by the Romans died as a result of the beating. This wasn't a lash that left a mark. These were whips with chunks of bone at the end that would dig into your back, and as the whipper pulled it back, would tear, chunks of flesh from your bone. People bled to death quickly. It was horrible. Not only that, but most folks would confess to anything just to have it stop. Did you do it? Yes, I did it, even if you didn't do it. Of course I did it. Just quit hitting me. And the Lord had nothing to say, nothing to confess. So this was Pilate's, his idea of a compromise. I'll beat him, and then I'll let him go. Now, in the midst of that planning with them, we are told here in Mark as well, I think verse 6, that the people began to cry out for this practice of releasing a prisoner to them at the Passover, whichever prisoner they chose. That was a practice to keep, Rome and the Jews kind of, on the same page. So we read in verse 6 that at the feast it was customary to release a prisoner to them, whoever they requested. And there was a man named Barabbas. He was chained to his fellow rebels. He had committed murder in the rebellion, and the people began to out loud ask that he, Pilate, would do what he had always done for them. So you stop at verse 8 and you say, okay, so Pilate is now making a deal, according to Luke, with the guys at the gate when he starts hearing the chant, prisoner released. And he went like this, aha, prisoner released. I hadn't even thought about that. This will be great. I'll release Jesus to them. Because everyone loves Jesus. Everyone's had the benefit of his goodness. It's just these religious guys that have been threatened by him and are jealous of them. And it's almost like a light went on in Pilate's mind. This is what I can do. I don't even have to scourge them now. I'll just bring them out and give them a choice between a guy everyone's got to hate and a guy no one can hate. And now surely they'll make the right choice. And so Mark tells us about this fellow Barabbas. He was a vicious criminal. He was a first century terrorist. He had tried to overthrow the government. He was in jail, John says, for robbery as well as for murder. And his name is not Barabbas because that's a title. Bar Abbas. It literally means son of the Father. As such, he becomes a perfect picture of what Jesus came to do for us. Understand this. Jesus died on the cross built for this guy. Right? This is Barabbas' cross. This is Barabbas' payment for Barabbas' sin. Barabbas deserved to die. And yet Jesus would die in his place so that you and I, through faith in him, could be made children of the Father, sons and daughters of the Father. It's a beautiful picture, right? This was God's plan. It wasn't at all what maybe was understood at the time, but we can become, God's children through faith in the sacrifice where Jesus hung on our cross, the one we deserve to hang on. We're the guilty party, right? He's not. So we walk because he suffered. We're off because he died. That's the exchange. For Pilate, it was a thought of, I can get Jesus out of here scot-free and just take this guy out who deserves to be taken out. And so that was Pilate's plan. Matthew tells us in chapter 27 that as Jesus said to the crowds, and we don't read it in Mark here, verse 9, but before verse 9, Pilate says to the crowds, all right, I'll release a prisoner to you. Would you want Barabbas or do you want Jesus, who is called the Christ? And brought them both out. Jesus was already pretty beaten up. I don't know what Barabbas looked like, but he was in chains, and I don't think he was a friendly-looking fella. In the midst of him presenting to the people, before they even got to yell their votes, if you like, Matthew tells us that a servant came from his wife, interrupted the whole procedure, thought it was absolutely essential that she get to him right now, and she interrupts Pilate and pulls him over and delivers the message to him, don't have anything to do with this just man. I've suffered many things today in a dream because of him. And as he's getting this note from his wife, the chief priests and the scribes begin to work the crowd. The interruption was God's doing because God wanted his son to die. Had there been no interruption, I am sure the people would have asked for Jesus to be released. He was loved by the people, certainly more so than he was loved by the religious leaders. But they began to work the crowd, we are told in Matthew. They began to persuade the multitudes. They began to put pressure. You better vote like we tell you. You know, these guys were powerful men at the time. And so they worked the crowd as Pilate is being interrupted, if you will. And when Pilate comes back to ask them for their opinion and their judgment, he's blown away. Because he says, which one? And they begin to yell, release to us Barabbas. Let Barabbas, the insurrectionist, the murderer, the robber, let him go free. Which two do you want me, of the two do you want me to release? Matthew records Pilate saying, and they all cried out, release Barabbas. And then he said to them, well, then what should I do with Jesus that is called the Christ? And you can read it here in verse 9 as well. Pilate then said to them, do you want me to release you the king of the Jews? He knew that he had been handed over out of envy, but the chief priests had stirred up the crowd. They began to cry for Barabbas, and Pilate said to them, what then do you want me to do with him who is called king of the Jews? And they said, you should crucify him. And Pilate says, why? What evil has he done? But they cried out all the more, crucified him. And so Pilate, wanting to gratify the crowds, he released Barabbas to them, and he delivered Jesus over after he had scourged him to be crucified. Now, Pilate could not have been more surprised at the response of the people, right? The court is out of session, though, you realize that. Now the judge is asking the people what to do. All right, you want that guy? What am I supposed to do with this guy? Well, you can kill him. Yeah, he hasn't done anything wrong. Yeah, you kill him anyway. But he hasn't done anything wrong. And he is now disputing with the crowd. He asked the most important question of all. What shall I do with Jesus? And if nothing else, you can't walk away from watching this all take place at the cross and realize that you're going to have to decide about Jesus for yourself. You can't walk away from the question. I know a lot of people, and maybe you do as well, that seem to approach Christianity and the gospel with a I can take it or leave it attitude. Well, if it's good for you, it's good for you. I've got other ideas. And everybody they stake out their opinions about Jesus one way or the other. The problem is Jesus' claims are so radical, you can't really do that. Right? It isn't like politics where you sort of like what someone has to say and you sort of don't like it, and so you pick and choose what you like. Jesus comes around and he says this, I am the only way to heaven. You want to get to heaven, you need me. Now you can't be like, oh, I can take that or leave that. No, if he's right, you better take it. And if he's wrong, you better run from him. There really is no middle ground, right? You can't be sort of in with that. If he says, without me, you can do nothing, and you'll die in your sins, and it's only my name that will get you to heaven, and I'm the only way, and I'm the only truth, and I'm the only life, you can't go, yeah, I guess that's all right. No, it is or it isn't true. And the consequences are serious enough where if he says, you can't make it to heaven without me, you're either going to have to believe him and choose to follow him, or you're going to have to decide he's crazy, and I'm going to refuse his claims. If you're not for him, then you're against him. If you're not confessing him, then you're denying him. And you can't avoid the issue. And here's the paradox. Whatever you decide about Jesus will have no effect on Jesus. He'll still be God. It'll have an eternal effect upon you. Because what you decide will have the greatest impact on your eternal destiny. I had a guy a couple of days ago, I was sharing with him. He said, I don't want to serve a God that would send me to hell. And I said to him, I don't know for sure, but I think I've read the whole Bible a few times, and God doesn't send anybody to hell. God came to keep you out of hell. If you end up in hell, that'll be your choice, pal. In fact, here's a roadmap. Just turn right at the light. Turn to Jesus. Go to the cross. You don't have to go to hell. That's your decision. It's the decision you've made. And though Pilate kind of unwittingly stumbles on the question, maybe the most important one of all, he unfortunately makes the decision to put his soul in eternal jeopardy because he's just not willing to do the right thing. Everything Pilate had planned had failed. Now the crowd is screaming. In fact, if you read the account in Luke chapter 23, it says 3 different times, he goes, he's not done anything wrong. And they scream louder. When you don't have a leg to stand on, usually the only thing you can do is turn up the volume, right? And they did. They screamed and screamed and screamed some more for his blood, for him to be killed. And the crowds won the day. 9 times Pilate says he's innocent, but the crowd wins. And Pilate's running out of time. And he just doesn't get it. He just doesn't see it. So he has one more option. And it was the option that he had thought about before he'd heard about the prisoner release. He'd scourge Jesus. He'd play on the sympathy of the crowd. Again, Mark doesn't, for the most part, cover it, but John does. And he writes in chapter 19, verse 1, these words. So Pilate took Jesus and he scourged him. And the soldiers twisted a crown of thorns into his head. They put a purple robe upon him. They said to him, "Hail, King of the Jews." They struck him with their hands. And Pilate went out again to the people. And he said, "Behold, I am bringing him out to you that you may know I find no fault in him." And so he brought Jesus out, standing, wearing a crown of thorns and a purple robe. Pilate said to them, "Ecce homo," behold the man. And when the chief priests and the officers saw it, they began to scream out, "Crucify him, crucify him." And Pilate says, "You take him and crucify him. I find no fault in him." And they said, "We have a law. According to our law, he ought to die. He made himself out to be the Son of God." Now, Pilate plays his last card here, unparalleled cruelty. He's going to beat a guy to try to get himself off the hook. The soldiers slap him and they put a crown of thorns in his head after they have beaten him, a robe upon his brutalized back. They mock him as king. And Pilate, in that condition, drags out their God, so to speak, in his mind. Look at this guy. He bleeds like everyone else. He's not a god. He's just a man. In reality, Pilate marches out the results of his own cowardice. Isaiah would write in chapter 52, verse 14, that Jesus was marred more than any man. In this process, you couldn't recognize him as a man. I don't know if you've ever seen anybody in an accident, but this was horrible. From sweating great drops of blood in the garden, to being slapped in the face by Annas, to being beaten up by Caiaphas' soldiers as they played blind man's bluff, to being up all night and dragged to and fro from one place to another, to having Herod's men rough him up, and now these professional torturers, about bringing him within an inch of his death, and then mocking him and bringing him out in front of the people and saying, "Look at this man." Imagine. I read it and it just blows my mind. Jesus was a man of tremendous courage. He was a man's man. And yet he was silent as a lamb before her slaughterers. We read in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2, that for the joy set before him, he endured this whole process. Know this, you were in his mind here. Your sin, your salvation. Not just us as a group, but you individually with your name on his mind. For the joy set before him, the fact that you could go to heaven, that you could get out from under sin, that you could be delivered from death and from hell. That's why he came. And to watch the process and the brutality of a guy like Pilate, who hoped to, I think, get sympathy by yelling, "Look at the man here." He didn't get it. The crowd just got wilder, yelled a little louder, even at this horrible sight. And Pilate argued with him. He's not guilty. Well, just give him to us. Kill him. And Pilate finally yells out, you kill him. And they said, we can't. And our law says that he should die. He made himself out to be God, Son of God. And it freaked Pilate out. John says that he ran in and said to Jesus, where are you from? Because the Romans believed in lots of gods. And Jesus didn't answer him at all. Not a word. And Pilate says, you should talk to me. You realize I have the power to put you to death and to release you. And Jesus said, you don't have any power over me at all, unless it was given to you by my Father in heaven. And he said to Pilate, you're guilty of what you're doing, but there's one even more culpable than you, the one who delivered me to you. And no doubt he's making a reference to the high priest and those guys who had the scriptures. They were knowledgeable of the truth. They should have compared verse for verse and found out Jesus was the Messiah. Pilate, he came from a Gentile understanding of the gods, and he wouldn't have had any clue really beyond his fear of doing the right thing and the cost it would involve him. And Jesus said, you're culpable for what you've done. But there's one even more culpable than you. And he uses the word for delivered, which is also the word for betrayed, when it's used of Judas. The one who betrayed me to you is even more culpable. He has the greater sin. And you read in John that from that moment on, Pilate ran out again, and he tried to get them to let Jesus go. And they finally yelled at him and said, if you let this man go, you're no friend of Caesar's, because he speaks out against Caesar. And Pilate, sitting in the judgment chair, finally just brought him down, and then he washed his hands at 6 o'clock in the morning, Roman time, according to John. He said, I'm washing my hands of this innocent man's blood. And the people said, let his blood be upon us and upon our children. And so he was delivered over to their wishes. They got what they wanted, if you will. And the empty words of this coward would come back to haunt his life. Now, the good news is no matter how corrupt humanity gets, God is still in charge, right? There's a scripture that says in chapter 8 of Proverbs that by me the kings will reign and the rulers will decree justice, and by me princes will rule, and nobles and the judges of the earth. In other words, nothing gets by God. As a Christian, trying to develop a worldview today is very difficult because of what the world has become. On the other hand, don't ever lose sight of the fact that as horrible as things and corrupt as they get, God is still in charge. And so the crowd's crying and cheering and all. We read in verse 12 here of our passage, what should I do with him called King of the Jews? Christ crucified. He hasn't done anything wrong. And they yelled some more. Pilate releases Barabbas. He delivers Jesus to them, gratifies the crowds, scourges him, as we read there in John, and then sends him off at 6 in the morning to be crucified. And the soldiers took him away from the praetorium. They gathered in a whole garrison. They clothed him again in the scarlet or the purple crown of thorns in his head. Hail, King of the Jews, they mocked him. They struck him in the head with a reed, spat upon him, bowed their knee, worshipped him, and they mocked him. Then they took all of these off and put on his own clothes. You can just imagine how that's got to feel, all those wounds. And they led him off to be crucified. Maybe the saddest verse in all of this is verse 15, that Pilate did it to satisfy the crowd. I would say to you this morning as a Christian, and it is more difficult, I think, in our generation now to live for the Lord than it was 25 years ago, when it was a bit in vogue, actually. But be careful that the world doesn't prevail over your commitment to Christ. Or, if you will, stand proudly for Jesus no matter the resistance you find. You certainly don't want to live your Christian life gratifying the people around you. If you're different here in the morning than you are at your job, or you're different here than you are with your family, or you're different here than you are with your friends, that's a problem. That's a problem. That's what Pilate did. That's what Pilate did. In fact, you can almost, you could respect the people in the crowds more so than Pilate, who knew better and didn't make a choice. Kind of wasteful. At least some of those guys screaming at the gate had made up their minds. They were wrong. But justice hasn't prevailed here. You don't want to let your conscience be silenced by the crowd. And you don't want to be afraid of the cost of following Jesus simply because of what others will think. It won't matter to you when you stand before him that day. Then you'll be able to say, oh, no, I was faithful to you. And I don't mind doing that at all. I mean, that's what God has called us to do. But if you look at the pictures here, if you look at all of the big picture where the Lord paints this picture of everyone around him, Pilate tried to avoid Jesus. He tries to avoid the consequences to do the right thing. He doesn't make the right decision. He questions Jesus. He trembles at Jesus' response. And in the end, his word doesn't make any difference to him at all. He wanted popularity in the short term rather than being righteous. He wanted reputation in the short term rather than being a man of honest character. He wasted his opportunity. So you can go through the cross and you can begin to watch the people groups and their responses. There was the Sanhedrin that stood at the door screaming hatred because Jesus had revealed their hearts. Sometimes when the Lord shows you who you are, you have a couple of choices. You can follow him or try to get rid of him. They wanted to get rid of him. Just kill him at all costs. Hey, we'll go to church later on this afternoon, but first we got to kill an innocent guy. And that's what they did. And that's somehow they could live with that. There was a crowd that a week earlier were singing, "Blessed is he that comes in the name of the Lord," and laying their coats down in front of the donkey. He's here. He's the one who 7 days later are screaming, "His blood be on us and our children. Kill him." And they seemed to be moved by whatever the loudest voice was around them, even to the point of being told who to vote for and who to follow. They really didn't have any of their own kind of ability to discern. They were just fickle. And fickle is pretty much what you get from the word. I'll tell you what, if you're a good baseball player and you have a good year, everyone will stand every time you come to the bat. But if you, a couple years later, bat 150, and you've had a bad year, everyone's booing you. And they want you to be traded along with your manager. The crowds are fickle. They won't put up with it for long. If you're doing good, you're in the limelight. But be careful when your ratings drop. You can be like Herod in your response to Jesus. Herod knew and heard gladly what John said about Jesus. Don't know how close he got, but he had to get pretty close to be gladly hearing the gospel. 2 years later, Herod can make fun of Jesus and treat him as nothing and spit him out. He has no conviction now in his heart. There's nothing that moves him. You can be like Pilate's wife, whose her only counsel is have nothing to do with him. Get away from him, this judged man. Or you can be like Pilate, look to get out from under ever having to decide or pay a cost for following him. Or there's one other thing you can do. You can believe in him. The thief on the cross would join the rabble for a while, but at some point along the way realized that he was the sinner and Jesus was not. And he turned. And he believed. And he was certainly, one of the earliest believers, if you will, at the cross. There was that Roman centurion who was part of the execution squad, who said as he died, certainly this was the Son of God. And there'll be others. But the reason God shines such a big light on not only the sacrifice of his Son, which is our ticket in, our hope, right? The name above all other names. You also get to look at it standing in the shadows all around the cross, what people did with him. And you can literally draw parallels, I think, with people's lives today. The arguments are the same. The resistance is the same. It's hatred. It's fickleness. It's mockery. It's the unwillingness to admit what we are and what we need, to just the irresponsibility that Pilate shows and just the cowardice that drove him away. Or you can believe. I'm standing with Jesus. I think in the end we're going to win. What do you think? And the world needs to see that in our church and in the lives of God's people. You can run into his loving arms and find eternal life. It's just going to cost you something to follow him, but nothing compared to what he paid to save you. Father, for the joy set before you, we sit here this morning thanking you for your faithfulness, that you didn't step away from the cross, that you didn't somehow balk before the price was paid. That, Lord, you give us so much to think about in these pictures of the days and the hours leading up to Calvary. We pray that a familiar story will not be lost on us, that it won't find hardened hearts or familiarization to the point where we now treat it with contempt, but rather, Lord, that we would apply this to us and consider who we are and what you've done for us so that we would follow you. And I would encourage you to do that. You know, the cross and all of these verses that lead up to Calvary and all are important for your spiritual well-being. I think they'll humble you to think, gosh, the Lord loves me this much. Nobody else would love me like this, but he will. And to think for a minute that this was done for you should keep you always wanting to serve him with all that you have. It's an amazing portrait. And God gives us much of it so we don't lose sight of his sacrifice. We're going to spend the next 3 weeks with Jesus just on the cross in those 6 hours. And then 4 more weeks at an empty tomb before we move on to the next thing. But that the Lord would give us everything we need. And if you don't know Jesus this morning, understand he's the only way. You're never going to stand before him and argue your case based on your good efforts, your positive frame of mind, your resume, or you know somebody who's really religious. You're never going to be able to get into heaven based on what you've done. You're only going to get there based on what he's done, which means in the formula for you going to heaven, there better be that name, Jesus. I'm a sinner who met Jesus. I'm going to heaven. I failed. I met Jesus. I'm going to heaven. I don't have what it takes, but I've met Jesus, and he's going to bring me in, and he's going to stand up for me. You see, if Jesus isn't in the equation, you're not going to heaven. And it won't be his fault. It'll be yours, because he has done all that he can do to provide you a way out. Just go right at the light and head for him. And if you want to come up and pray with one of our pastors this morning to receive Jesus, John says in chapter 6, he'll in no wise turn you out. I don't care what you've done, where you've been, just bring it all to Jesus. And you'll find that his death, as horrible as it was sufficient to rid you of your sin. He's hanging on your cross so you could live in glory with him. So you come this morning. Let the Lord into your life. Shall we stand?